introduction and welcome all of you. And I understand there's 80-something people online, so nice to not be able to see any of you, but here we are. So, gosh, I've been talking about this topic in the most recent iteration since January 20th, because I think that Mr. Trump issued his executive order on birthright citizenship that day or maybe the day after. But truthfully, this is a topic that I've debated over for many decades. This is not an issue, the attack on birthright citizenship, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But first, I want to give a little bit of context to maybe not even this topic. It would be crazy of me to not talk about, at the very beginning, the world that we're living in right now with respect to the attack on immigrants. And so I do want to give you a little bit of context, just of the last 3 or 4 days of my life, okay? And so it started on Friday. Let me start on Friday, when woke up for a 7 o'clock flight with a group of the immigration clinic students to fly down to San Diego and met with a former migration studies alum, Maria Silva, and a former law student of mine, Maria Rodriguez. I only know people named Maria in San Diego. And we went to a historic park, Chicano Park in San Diego, to learn about the movement there. And then we ate at a great hole-in-the-wall restaurant after that. Then we went to a place called Casa Familiar, which is in San Isidro along the border, where we talked about their rapid response network. They were asking for our advice and also to tell us how things have changed just since January. One, the shelters are empty, okay, on both sides of the border, actually, which was a huge shock. I had heard that before, but it's a surprise. And so the arrests are down along the border. I think it's something like 7,000 arrests in the last several months compared to over 100,000 same time period a year ago. And Mr. Trump will take credit for that, but in actuality, the reason for the decline in shelters demand and also the decline of arrests along the borders, people are going other places, and they're still fleeing, and they're looking for places. They're looking for safety, and they're not finding it in the United States. So ordinarily, my clinic students and I, and Professor Cole, who's in the audience, did this with us once. Ordinarily, we spend several days on the other side of the border counseling migrants who need counseling at the border. But because of the decline in the number of folks there, we decided to do something other that is a page out of rebellious lawyering, which is to actually do the best that you can to understand where your clients are from and where they live and what they've gone through. So, listen, I've gone on desert routes before, mostly in southern Arizona, where migrants have traversed, but usually only for an hour or two at a time. But on Saturday, we went with what used to be Border Angels, what used to be Border Kindness, which is now part of Al Otro Lado, to do a water drop, to take water and food to 5 different spots. And they have much more than 5 different spots in the area down there. But the route that we went with our leader was 5 different drop spots. And I later on, I should have uploaded some of the pictures. I didn't know what I was getting into. And the student, a former also migration studies student, Casey Tixot, who had done it a dozen times before, this was harder for her. She said this was the hardest route that she had ever taken before. It took us 6 hours to go 3 miles in and out. It was round trip, so it's total of about 6 miles. It was basically rocks the whole time and boulders the whole time. And it got to be 104 degrees by the time that we finished. And I'm the oldest person that ever volunteered for them. They were kind of surprised that I was able to finish, but it was very educational because, and I've seen this before, a lot of strewn clothes, diapers, and the leaders often have to do search and rescue on different times, and that continues to happen because our policy, which started with Bill Clinton actually, is to shove people to the most dangerous routes in some insane theory of deterrence, that somehow people won't go through the dangerous routes, but they do, they try because they're desperate. So that's that, and then even today, yes, many people still use Signal in spite of the most recent news about Signal. I'm on 2 different Signal groups, and the Slater, are you on the Signal group for San Francisco? Okay, so anyway, so just a typical day in San Mateo. ICE comes at 6:30 in the morning to knock on somebody's door, but the person they were looking for and shouting for had already left for school, a high school student who's 18 years old, who is in proceedings, is not hiding, has shown up at a hearing already, but hasn't filed an application yet, but there's still time because the person's eligible for special immigrant juvenile status, and they entered as a juvenile 2 years ago. But they came and scared the mother, and so the rapid response person had to call the mother to reassure her that things would be okay, and legal aid in San Mateo is going to intervene and make sure that an application is going to be filed. Then in San Francisco, the Faith in Action folks, 4 Faith in Action folks accompanied a mother and a father and their infant baby to 630 Sansom Street for a check-in. They are not in proceedings. They're from a South American country, and they were paroled into the United States, and they disappeared for a while. And the 4 people accompanying them didn't know what to happen, and so they immediately signaled the folks who are on call in San Francisco, and it hasn't ended. This has been going on now for 3 hours on the Signal group. That are they detained or are they not detained? Because if they're detained, they have 3 little girls that are in school right now, and so if they're detained, somebody's going to have to go and take care of those 3 little girls, and so an immigration attorney immediately is just dispatched to 630 Sansom Street and has to wait in line and is demanding to see the woman. The woman still, her phone hasn't been taken away yet, and they're communicating with the Faith in Action folks that are outside in the hallway. And the last I've heard is that they're not going to be taken into detention. They asked the mother if she was nursing, which she is. Can't remember what they asked the father, but for the father, I know that they put him on order of supervision, and they're signing it up for ISAP, which is the check-in system. So it looks like they're not going to be detained, but still not 100% sure. So that's just a flavor of what's happening today and locally. And of course, and I'll allude to this at the end, but we know nationally just so many different things are happening. So, but to the topic of today, which is birthright citizenship, these are the 5 areas that I'm going to talk about today. And so it begins with a case right out of San Francisco. Wong Kim Ark was born on Sacramento Street in Chinatown, the 700 block of Chinatown. And his parents, this is important, his parents were lawful immigrants to the United States. They entered before the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Chinese Exclusion Act was enacted in 1882. They entered long before that. In fact, he was born, Wong Kim Ark was born in the early 1870s, so he was born before the Chinese Exclusion Act. And the importance of the fact that they entered before the Chinese Exclusion Act is the following, that there really were no immigration laws before the Chinese Exclusion Act, in the sense that anyone who made it to the United States was a lawful permanent resident. There actually was not an application to fill out. You got on a boat in Europe, you landed in Ellis Island, and you became an immigrant. You were a lawful immigrant. Same with Chinese. So there actually was not an application form that you filled out. And so Wong Kim Ark's parents, by virtue of the fact that they entered before the Chinese Exclusion Act, made them lawful permanent residents, and so they were immigrants. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So they came from southern China, where most Chinese immigrants historically to the United States came to the United States probably through the 1960s, 1970s. Most Chinese immigrants to the United States came from southern China. That's no longer true, but they were, the parents worked as merchants, and he grew up, and he was eventually became a cook, Wong Kim Ark, and the parents decided to go back to China, in part because they got the message that Chinese weren't welcome in the United States, because the root of the foundation for anti-Chinese sentiment was in California. And ironically enough, San Francisco was a hotbed for anti-Chinese sentiment. I say ironically because there's Asian Americans, including Chinese Americans in San Francisco, have a certain amount of political clout now in San Francisco. And so it's ironic that this is where the birth of much of the anti-Chinese sentiment was. And so in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act passes. The parents and Wong Kim Ark, the parents decide, well, we want to go back to China. And Wong Kim Ark says, well, I don't want to go back permanently, but can I go back and can you help me find a spouse? Because I can't marry, there's no one here. There aren't hardly any women, Chinese women. And because of anti-miscegenation laws, I can't marry anyone who's not Asian. Okay, so they take him back to China at the age of 19 or so, and he does find a bride, he does get married, and within a year, his wife is pregnant, and he comes back to the United States to make his fortune as a cook. And that's 1889. And what's interesting is that on his entry into the United States, the inspector raised the issue, are you Chinese? I mean, are you a US citizen? And he said, well, yeah, I was born here in San Francisco, and I do have a birth certificate. And so the inspector really didn't know what to do, but let him in and made a note in his immigration file that this person was born in San Francisco, but he came in after the Chinese Exclusion Act, and I'm not sure if he's really a citizen, but I let him in. Okay, so he lets him in, and a few years later, he decides to go back to China again, and sees his child for the first time, visits for a year or so, then he returns. This time, the immigration agent who looks at the note says, you're not a citizen. He says, yes, I was born on Sacramento Street. No, you're not a citizen because you came back after the Chinese Exclusion Act, and Chinese cannot be citizens. And he said, what do you mean Chinese cannot be citizens? He said, well, Chinese cannot be naturalized citizens. You can't take a test to become, he said, I don't need to take a test to become a citizen because I was born here. I have birthright citizenship. And so back then there actually were, just like there are now, there are good immigration lawyers who are willing to step in and make the case. And he was represented by good immigration lawyers who eventually took the case all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled, not unanimously, but ruled in his favor that because he was born in the United States, that he's a US citizen. And what they relied on was the 14th Amendment, okay? And the 14th Amendment was enacted along with, let me see where I am here, okay? I'll come back to that slide in a minute. It was enacted after the end of the Civil War. And the 14th Amendment basically reads, all persons born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. Let me repeat that. All persons born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. It does not make a reference to parents. It does not make a reference to nationality. It just says all persons born in the United States. Sorry. So the Supreme Court, the majority says it's literally, he literally meets the requirements because he's born here, and obviously he's subject to the jurisdiction because we've got power over him, and if he committed a crime, we could prosecute him for that, and so obviously we have jurisdiction. So it's significant because, the court talks about this in its opinion, that we grant birthright citizenship not to this Chinese person of Chinese background, but also people from Europe who have been born here, from European parents, and so of course it applies everywhere. And it's not even an equal protection case. It's not a case about discriminating between one group against another. It's just about everyone who was born here who's a citizen. So it's significant, and this has been the law ever since then. And so, but just to back up, to understand a little bit about how we got to the 14th Amendment, it actually begins with something that maybe we all studied, those of us who went to school in the United States anyway. We studied as part of US history, and it's pre-Civil War. And it begins with the Dred Scott decision in 1857. Dred Scott was a slave, an African slave who was owned by a slave master in Missouri, and that slave master took him to two different parts of the country that were free states. They took him to Wisconsin and took him to Illinois. And they spent time there. And when he came back, when they brought him back to Missouri, he brought a lawsuit claiming that he should be considered free because he had been taken to places where slavery was not lawful. And to make a long story short, he lost his case. And he lost his case in a 7-2 decision by the Supreme Court that basically held that once you are a slave in the United States, you are always a slave, no matter where you are taken in the United States. And on top of that, you don't even have standing because you're a slave. You don't have a right to even be in this court because you are not a full person. And so you don't have standing to bring this lawsuit. That's important, of course, because there was division in the country, even then, over the legality and, of course, the morality of slavery. And the fact that the Supreme Court made this decision actually drove the country further apart. And historians point to Dred Scott, this case, as another factor that eventually led to the Supreme Court. Because when Abraham Lincoln ran for president, he ran in part on a platform that the Dred Scott decision was decided incorrectly, and that he would do everything that he could to eradicate slavery, and we know that he kept that promise. And so after the Civil War, the next move that was made by the leaders of the country was the passage of the 13th and the 14th Amendment. The 13th Amendment is the anti-slavery statute, and the 14th Amendment is what I just read to you. And so that's what benefited the argument that Wong Kim Ark had. So what's happened since Wong Kim Ark? Well, I'm going to read a little bit about the executive order in a minute. I believe that the executive order is not artfully crafted by President Trump, but I believe that what he and many anti-birthright citizenship folks are after is primarily the children who are born here whose parents are undocumented. That's my primary thinking that they're after, and they've articulated that they're very upset at Mexicans who are undocumented, who have been here undocumented, and their parents are born here. I mean, their kids are born here, and they get birthright citizenship. But they're also upset at upper middle class Asians from Taiwan, Hong Kong, some South Koreans, because of something called birthright tourism. And so, and you can Google that term later, that there are travel companies that cater to pregnant Asian women in those countries that I just mentioned, who they pay a fee to the company, so they come here. It's not, some of my students call it a loophole. I don't call it a loophole. I call it the law, okay? The law permits somebody to come here and give birth, and their kids are US citizens. And some Asians pay to do that, and it doesn't cost the US anything. The hospital bill is paid for, the travel bill is paid for, the hotel bill is paid for, and the kid is born here, and then they take the kid back home with them to Taiwan. You might ask why. And for some, they have a very long-range plan because you don't actually benefit from having a U.S. citizen child here until the child is 21. When the child is 21, then the child can petition for you. But and part of it is because of they want their kids to be able to come here without any problem. Part of it is that they, for the people in Taiwan anyway, they're worried about, and maybe South Korea, they're worried about the political situation, and Hong Kong too. And so that's what they're thinking. So there's been some complaint about that as well. But I have been very curious about, on the first issue of undocumented parents, what has happened post Wong Kim Ark in the legal world. And these are two examples of Supreme Court cases that, again, they were decided a long time ago. Wong Kim Ark was decided in 1898, and these were decided more than many years ago as well. And so in the first case, it was parents who were overstayed their non-immigrant visas. And the parents were claiming, well, you shouldn't deport us because we have a citizen child. And the Supreme Court said, well, you overstayed your visa, you're still deportable, okay? But they did agree that the children were US citizens, so that's important. And then a few years later, another immigration case, parents who entered without inspection, again, they were deportable, but their kids, the Supreme Court said, it's no question that they're US citizens. And so, based on cases like this, legal scholars and other litigators, other politicians have always assumed that the only way you can get rid of birthright citizenship is by amending the 14th Amendment. And so that's where we are right now. Where we are right now is in a world that most legal scholars agree that birthright citizenship is founded on the 14th Amendment, and the only way that you can get rid of it is by amending the 14th Amendment. Okay, so Mr. Trump's executive order, which again was issued just either that day or the day after his inauguration, is written as follows. Okay, so let me read it to you. And you can look it up, but it was actually issued on the day he was inaugurated, January 20th. It says that citizenship by birth does not automatically extend to those persons when the parent's mother, when that person's mother is unlawfully present here, and the father is not a citizen. So that's one group, okay? If the mother's unlawful and the father is not a citizen, then the executive order would not allow that person to be a citizen. And so that includes anyone where both are undocumented. Then the second example that's given in the executive order is when the mother's presence in the United States at the time of birth was lawful but temporary. Okay, which means if the mother is here lawfully on a student visa or a visitor's visa, those are two big examples of temporary visas, and the father is not a citizen. So that means that if a foreign student has a spouse who's a lawful permanent resident, somebody with a green card, a foreign student, lawfully here as a student, and the spouse is a lawful permanent resident with a green card, that kid is not a US citizen under the executive order. And so it's more than, they're attacking more than just the people whose parents were both unlawful. What's happened, however, is that there have now been 10 different lawsuits over this issue that have been filed, and all of them have ruled in favor of birthright citizenship. So the Trump administration has gotten nowhere and on this issue. And in this one case that I have cited up here, Casa versus Trump, the federal judge came this close to calling the government attorneys, basically called them not very intelligent. He could not believe the arguments that they were advancing in front of him with a straight face, that somehow this executive order was constitutional, and basically said, go back and tell your boss that you're barking up the wrong tree here. And so this issue, however, will get to the Supreme Court. This issue will get to the Supreme Court, and it could be by virtue of one of these cases. These cases were filed affirmatively by attorneys general around the country. The city attorney here in San Francisco filed one. There's one other way that this issue is going to be raised, and it's not going to be pretty, okay? I believe that one of the ways this issue is going to be raised is by a county official in some place like Texas, where the county official will refuse to issue a birth certificate on the grounds that the parents are undocumented. And that family will need to get an attorney or ACLU to bring a lawsuit requesting that the county official be ordered to issue a birth certificate. Why do I pick on Texas? Because Texas is the root of all evil, sorry. Texas itself has for many years now engaged in something called Operation Lone Star, which has just many different anti-immigrant laws that are questionably constitutional, including such things as authorizing a state court judge to deport people, for example. And so I wouldn't be surprised if Texas is the first to not issue a birth certificate. So before I get to this, what's my prediction at the Supreme Court? It changes every day, actually. Today, I'm willing to predict that the Supreme Court will uphold Wong Kim Ark. The 14th Amendment is just so clear. And we have jurisdiction over people. And the 14th Amendment does not refer to parents. And even the parents we have jurisdiction over. But I just can't see how the Supreme Court would do otherwise. And so I know there's other attorneys in the room, but the reason I have a little bit of faith in the Supreme Court is because of what they did recently on two of the cases that are relevant to this slide, which this slide is just random things that I could have put 20 different things up here, right, of different immigration things that are happening today. But the Supreme Court made two decisions last week that are significant on upholding the Constitution. One case was the case involving the 200 plus people that were put on an airplane to El Salvador without any hearings, right? And most of them were Venezuelans. And the challenge to that, which the Trump administration used something called the Alien Enemies Act to, they claim, have authority to just pick up people that they think are gang members based on tattoos and other crazy things, and just put them on a plane and send them to a prison where the president of El Salvador is very happy to take US money to put them in these awful jails, because he loves doing that, and don't get me started in Bukele, because I won't end, because this guy's, and just to see Trump and him sitting next to each other, was it yesterday? I'm losing track of time. I just couldn't believe it. But the Supreme Court ruled, yes, first of all, the court did not specifically uphold the Alien Enemies Act here, okay? It said we're not going to reach the question of whether or not it's properly being used. They said that question should first be addressed below, meaning at another court level, and also it should be in a kind of proceeding in federal court called habeas corpus. And so the headlines were wrong when the headline said the court upholds the use of the Alien Enemies Act. No, the court said that this is what the headline should have been. 9 justices, including Alito and Clarence Thomas, 9 justices said there needs to be a hearing before you deport these people, okay? And we'll reach the issue of the Alien Enemies Act later on. So to me, that showed me that the Supreme Court at least understands the need for due process, okay? And then they did the same thing, was that a day later, I'm losing track of time, on the Abrego Garcia case, who's the individual was on that first flight, I don't know if he was on the first flight, I guess he was, who was somebody who had been granted had been granted relief, something akin to asylum called withholding. But he was not Venezuelan, he was Salvadoran. They sent him back to El Salvador, of all places, okay? And 9 judges again said, the president, the administration should facilitate his return, okay? Again, it's significant that neither Alito nor Thomas dissented from that. They didn't say, oh no, and so that's why I think at least due process is not dead in the United States. Will they bring this gentleman back? I'm not sure. Many of you may want to know that, but let me I'm supposed to save some time here for questions and answers, but let me just seriatim allude to these different things here. Deportation enforcement is not widespread in the sense of ICE walking up and down streets or in apartment buildings, just randomly asking people for documents and racially profiling. Certainly not here in the Bay Area, but in most part of the country. Is there collateral stuff that happens when they go after someone who's on a list? Do they collaterally ask racially profile? Yeah, they do that, okay, even here, okay? But they're not like just wholesale knocking on everyone's door doing that. F1 student visa revocation on the grounds that students supported the encampment or other types of pro-Palestinian criticizing the Israeli government, that's happening. They've revoked over 300 F1 visas at different universities across the country, and so those folks all need attorneys. But you should know that if you know anyone in that situation, first of all, there's a lot of resources available for those 300 right now. But secondly, even though they revoke your visa, as long as you're still going to school and you're not working without permission, you're still a valid foreign student, okay? All that means when your visa was revoked is that you can't leave and return without getting a new visa, okay? So the visa is what allows you to enter. But if they granted you status upon entry, you're still a valid student, okay? But they will look to see if you have done some other technical violation of your status. I alluded already to asylum and closure of the border, which all of this is inhumane that I've referred to, but I really do think that among the many inhumane things that are happening, it's closing the border to people who are fleeing violence without providing some kind of resource. And now, related to that, they're canceling parole that the Biden administration had granted in different ways to come here to apply for asylum. They're canceling. People are getting revocation notices, and they're being told to leave in 7 days, and that type of thing. So that's creating havoc, and all those folks need to get representation. There's 40-something travel ban countries in different grades. I'm getting inquiries every day from students, but also green card holders. Is it okay for me to travel this summer or for spring break and that kind of stuff? And if you're from one of those countries on that list, my short answer is no. That includes, this is sponsored by the Asia Pacific Center, it includes countries like Cambodia, Pakistan, there's one other Asian country I'm forgetting, but anyway, so it's an issue. And finally, I guess I'll just say that, this is why I alluded to in the beginning of my remarks, people are afraid, and I see this every weekend. My students and I have been doing, and some of you in the room have helped, do immigration information sessions. Some people are so afraid that they won't even go to our information sessions. So a couple of other churches, we're going to arrange to do a phone consultation thing instead, because some people are afraid of going to work and sending their kids to school, and it's really, I'd say, reporters are asking me, are people self-deporting out of fear? And I have had a few people tell me that they're thinking of leaving, and they don't see any hope, and they're from places that they think they can find a safe place. But let me stop there, because I know there's a range of questions, and we can go from there. Why? How do you want to handle the questions?
Thank you for your insightful talk. It's incredibly helpful to understand the context of birthright citizenship, and all the way back to 14th Amendment. So in the next section, we'd like to open the floor to questions. So if you're in person with us in this room, please raise your hand and we'll call on you. And if you're online, please put your question into the Q&A session. It's located in the Zoom toolbar. So we're gonna relay the question, so please keep the question short. There's no guarantee that we can get to every single question, but we'll get to as many as possible. In fact, days leading up to today's event, I've been receiving questions from audience who are not able to attend today's event, but will be counting on seeing the recording. So I will start this session with one question. So this audience said, how recent challenges to birthright citizenship might affect the use of marriage as a pathway to permanent residency? How do you see this pathway to citizenship changing over the next few years?
Well, first of all, the first Trump administration slowed everything down. Every type of application was slowed down. It created a backlog in processing that the Biden administration could not recover from completely. So everything's slower now than it used to be 8 years ago. If you have entered with inspection, namely a visitor's visa, student visa, or if you're a DACA person that entered with inspection, or you're a DACA person who got something called advanced parole, and you're married to a U.S. citizen, you should be able to adjust your status without any problem. And so it will take time, because processing time is slow, but I don't think they can derail that. I don't think they can derail a straight adjustment of status if you're married to a citizen and you entered with inspection. Yeah.
For Abrego Garcia, what?
One moment, can I?
They want to bring you a microphone, I think.
Any further questions, please raise your hand so I can come to you.
With Abrego Garcia, what would it look like if the Trump administration is held in contempt of the court over not returning him after the 9-0 ruling?
Yeah, I worry about that, because the question has to do with what if, so what the Supreme Court said is that we want evidence that you are facilitating his return, and the lower judge can be on top of you for making sure that you're acting in good faith, okay? Well, what if they don't act in good faith? What if they just don't even bring him back, and they say they haven't tried, or, well, we made a couple phone calls, but Bukele won't bring him back, even though we now know Bukele said yesterday, how can I bring a terrorist in? First of all, he's not a terrorist, okay? If bad faith is demonstrated, my hope is the Supreme Court recognizes it and says that, and supports a contempt finding by the trial judge, because that's the one who's going to have to hold the government in contempt. And if nothing happens, if they still don't do anything, then we are in a constitutional crisis. The Supreme Court the judiciary branch does not have an army. It doesn't have an army to go enforce. And one of the first things you learn in constitutional law in law school is that the balance of powers, checks and balances, it's based on good faith. It's based on respect for the constitutional framework. And so Richard Nixon understood that he was ordered to turn over stuff, and he did that. And there's other examples of that where the presidents, nobody hit them over the head with anything. They have to do it. If Donald Trump reaches that point where he doesn't follow orders, the only recourse then is impeachment. There is no other recourse at that point. And it's going to be whether or not the members of Congress have that, if they're courageous enough to do that. That's the only outcome that that's the only outcome that we're left with if the president refuses to follow orders of the court.
So yesterday,
you can be second, okay. Oh, which one? I'm sorry. Yeah.
Well, sorry, I didn't mean to butt in here, but I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about this question that's coming up that's related, which is the possibility, well, already we're seeing revocation of green card status, but currently the Trump administration is talking about revoking citizenship as well, naturalized citizens anyway. And I'm wondering if you think that there is actually a path toward doing that that might be successful.
So every day we do denaturalize people. There's denaturalization proceedings, but it's for people who are not eligible for naturalization in the first place for some reason. They hid something, right? There was a crime that wasn't discovered, or they came as they had been a terrorist or something before they got a green card. That kind of, there has to be evidence someplace in the past that you were not either eligible for your green card in the first place, or you weren't eligible at the time you applied for naturalization. But the first part of your question is relevant to me answering that question. The first part of your question was taking away lawful permanent residence from someone. They are trying something new. Usually you don't lose your lawful permanent residence, again, unless you were not eligible in the first place, or you committed a serious crime that makes you deportable, then you can lose your green card, right? Or you had a sham marriage. In other words, you weren't eligible in the first place. They are now trying something through the State Department called, the State Department has reasonable belief that you are engaging in actions that are contrary to US foreign policy, okay? And what they are alleging in Mr. Khalil's case, and he was the lawful permanent resident from Colombia who was very active in the pro-Palestinian movement on campus last spring. And they're saying the immigration judge ruled against him on Friday on this issue. He is a green card holder. That yes, they can take away your green card because your presence here is anti-Semitic. And anti-Semitism is contrary to US foreign policy. That judge relied solely on the declaration of Marco Rubio, did not rely on any evidence beyond that declaration, didn't bring in experts on what's US foreign policy, that kind of thing. And so that is very troubling, because if they can say that before you got your green card, or even while you have your green card, you are doing something that's contrary to foreign policy, and then after that you got naturalized, then you could, citizenship, then they could say, oh, when you got naturalized, we didn't realize that you had done all this pro-Gaza stuff, and so we're going to take away your naturalization. And so it would be multi-step, but 3 months ago, I would say that's crazy to even think that. Now it's not crazy to think that. I mean, it's still a crazy idea, but it's not crazy to think that, because they might try something like that for US citizens. They might come after me, okay? They might come after my citizens. Here's the theory, I'm giving it to them. The theory that they should come after me on to take away I was born in Arizona, okay? They should attack my birthright citizenship on the grounds that my parents were undocumented, which they were, and that I didn't have birthright citizenship because my parents were undocumented. And so they should try to take away my citizenship on the grounds that I was, under the executive order, that I wasn't eligible for citizen. I'm waiting for that to happen, okay? Then I'll become famous, so. Yeah, Miro.
So
One moment.
I'm sorry. So yesterday, there were some news that a couple of immigration attorneys in Boston, that were naturalized, actually got emails from USCIS saying that they have their parole which is insane, which is not even the same thing. But we're seeing that parole was revoked. So they had to leave the country immediately. So we have seen this now attack on immigration attorneys throughout this administration, with the student loans and also the impoundment of money that should be going to, for example, the unaccompanied minors.
Right.
So what are your opinions about this attack against the?
What was the status of those immigration attorneys?
Some of them were, I think most of them were naturalized citizens, just naturalized.
Okay.
That they just, because they're practicing immigration law, they're being just targeted.
Yeah, okay, so if they were naturalized citizens, they don't need to worry, okay? But there are a lot of parole revocation letters that got sent out that were also revoked. So they realized they were sending letters out to anyone who had been paroled in at one point, and then they realized some of the people that were paroled, they've changed their status now. And so there's a glitch in that system. But your bigger question is the important one, which is they're really trying to make it not just this the atmosphere and the fear of deportation, but they're trying to eliminate as much legal representation as possible. That's why, for example, people are detained in Louisiana or places in the middle of nowhere, because they know that there's not access to legal services in many of those places. That's why they've attempted to take away federal grant money for representing unaccompanied minors, even though that really wasn't enough to represent as many that are needed. It represented like 26,000. And some of our alum have lost their jobs who work for Kids in Need of Defense, who were working at those organizations. And believe it or not, those are non-attorneys in the room are not going to believe what I'm about to say. The government is not required to provide an attorney for a child facing removal, okay? They have to represent themselves, okay? Anyway, I know you don't believe that, but it's true. And so and then I'm losing track. 3 weekends ago, I was in Cleveland, and somebody showed me something when I was in Cleveland, when it was an attack on immigration lawyers, right? Saying that they want U.S. attorneys to investigate those of us who are representing people in asylum proceedings. It was very specific. Those attorneys who are representing people in asylum proceedings, you should be on a lookout for them, because we hear that they tell their clients to lie on how to get asylum. And so the minute you find out, this to the local U.S. attorneys, the minute you find one of those people that is coaching their clients to lie, we want to know, because we want to report them to the state bar, and we want to go after their licenses. So yeah, they're trying everything to make it harder for people to get legal status here. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation.
Sure.
First of all, it's very informative. I was just curious about what are your thoughts about Trump's comments deporting quote-unquote homelanders, or people who do have birthright citizenship?
Supporting who, sorry?
For deporting homelanders or people who do have birthright
Oh.
citizenship for committing crimes. So I'm just wondering if this could be done legally and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, again, he's putting the cart before the horse. You can't deport somebody who's a citizen, okay? It's kind of related to the question in the back. Immigration laws only apply to non-citizens, all right? So you can't deport a citizen. So he would have to be able to take away citizenship first and then deport. But now I think I'm understanding your question. Bukele is open, he's willing to open his prisons to US citizens as well. So if that's what you're asking, what can Trump make an agreement with Bukele to house US citizens who have been convicted of federal crimes, to house them in an El Salvadoran prison, okay? He may try that, okay? He may try that. It's gonna raise Eighth Amendment issues of cruel and unusual punishment. Again, 3 months ago, I would say that's a crazy thing to even think about, but now we know crazy is on the table. Yeah.
Thanks for the presentation, Professor.
Hello, Slater.
Hi, so we know that CBP manages the borders, and historically, resources have not been allocated to manage the coastline border. Is there any inclination that that might start? Is 100 miles within the coastal border, which would include San Francisco?
I wouldn't be surprised, because there are random reports of boats, allegedly bringing undocumented folks in. And here's one other, this also happened late on Friday afternoon. It went under the radar, and it is a page out of Texas, okay? On late Friday afternoon, they designated, this isn't exactly what you're saying, but it could be, Slater. They designated, I think it was 60 feet, maybe it's more than that, of the entire border from California, Arizona, and New Mexico, all the way to Texas, a US military zone, okay? So now, every part of the border to Texas is considered US military zone. Why? Because in the same announcement, they said, when somebody enters illegally, now, not only are we gonna charge them with misdemeanor illegal entry, because it is a crime already on the books, that if you enter illegally, it's a misdemeanor, okay? But now, by doing this, they're saying, you are entering a federal military zone without permission, and that's a felony, okay? So now they're gonna try to make it a felony to enter the United States because you're also entering a US military zone. The reason I say that's a page out of Texas, because Texas thought of that already. Texas did that 2 years ago. They have a Texas trespass law that if you enter illegally in Texas along the Mexico-Texas border, they also prosecute you for trespass in Texas. So that's where they got that idea from. And so I wouldn't be surprised if they're thinking about something up and down the coast of California, Oregon, and Washington. Good question, yeah.
We have an online question.
Okay.
An audience wants to know, is there a chance of something like Japanese internment or Chinese exclusion act happening again?
Wow. Well, first of all, you should know that an immigration laws in the United States can be racist, they can be sexist, they can be homophobic, they can be any and all of that, and they have been in different times in our history, and it's always upheld, okay? You can have the most offensive language in an immigration law, and it's always upheld because the Supreme Court has long held, since the early Chinese Exclusion Act case, that Congress has plenary power over immigration. So it can prefer Western Europeans over Asians, and that's always possible, and that has happened in the past. And so already he's kind of practicing the equivalent of Chinese exclusion because he's not designating any refugee admissions. The president gets to designate how many refugees can come into the United States, and that's different from an asylum applicant who makes it here and applies. Refugees are people that are vetted abroad, and then after 2 years or so, they get a refugee visa. Well, he's not gonna let any refugees in, and so, and the refugees that had been coming under Biden were largely from parts of Africa, some from the Middle East, some from Asia, and so that kind of exclusion is already happening. And if this kooky Congress wants to pass some racist immigration law, he'll sign it, and so it would be possible. Internment is I haven't thought much about that. That's a good question. Well, let me answer it this way. Detention is growing in the United States. ICE detention is growing very offensively. The two big private prison companies, GEO Group, GEO, and CoreCivic, CoreCivic, oh, they love when Trump got elected. There's these offensive quotes from their presidents and CEOs about, wow, we're gonna make a lot of money the next 4 years. And they're chomping at the bit for increased funding for detention. And so that's one answer to your question about internment, is that every day we're afraid when people have to go in for their regular ICE check-ins that they're gonna be detained. Just like the examples I gave you this morning. And so, yeah, I mean, you can call it internment, but detention is definitely on the right. And family detention is a thing. that ICE does, okay? And so it's usually the mother and the children, although there was one facility many years ago, it was father and the children, but it's never families. It's usually mother-child or father-child, and that still happens today.
There's one question from the audience about a point that you made earlier. The question is, how is the administration able to claim state secrets over deportation flights?
State secrets over,
Deportation flights.
well, they're claiming that it's a matter of national security and that the information is, whatever you call it, state secrets or whatever the term, I'm forgetting. And it's true that when it comes to U.S. Security and different international policies, that usually the courts stay out of that because there's a political question doctrine that's involved. But the courts always have the power to ask for something called an in-camera hearing, where it's not public, where it's in the judge's courtroom, in the judge's office, or that it's sent to a special court, the FISA court, which is a federal court that deals, and all those judges have gone through security. And I think Kavanaugh, one of those judges, sat on that before they were on the Supreme Court. And so if there's bad faith, that's where it's supposed to be discovered, and that's where the analysis is done. So it's not the end when they say that. There still is a mechanism for reviewing that.
Okay. Thank you so much, Bill, for sharing your time and insights with us today. A lot of things to unpack, a lot of more questions for you to answer. I think your clinic's going to be really, really busy. Yeah.
That's what we're there for. Thank you.
Right.